Looking back, I should have recognized the warning signs in Sandra's eyes that morning. My younger sister had always possessed this particular brand of volatility, but I'd grown so accustomed to managing it that I'd stopped seeing the danger entirely. The way she gripped her coffee mug too tightly, the sharp edge in her voice when she asked me to pass the sugar, the deliberate way she avoided meeting my gaze across our parents' breakfast table. 28 years of being her older sister had taught me to read these signals. Yet somehow, I missed the most important one of all. The comment I made wasn't even particularly provocative, at least not by our family's standards. We were discussing Sandra's latest career pivot, her decision to leave her marketing position to pursue what she called wellness consulting. Though none of us quite understood what that entailed, our parents had been expressing their usual blend of supportive concern and barely concealed skepticism, the kind of careful diplomatic language that families develop when someone repeatedly makes questionable life choices. I just think it might be wise to have some kind of backup plan, I'd suggested, reaching for the orange juice pitcher. Maybe keep your options open while you're building the new business. The words had barely left my mouth when Sandra's expression shifted completely. The transformation was so sudden and so complete that it caught everyone at the table off guard. One moment she'd been stirring honey into her tea with mechanical precision, and the next she was standing so abruptly that her chair scraped against the hardwood floor with a sound like nails on a chalkboard. "A backup plan," she repeated, her voice dropping to that dangerous whisper I remembered from our childhood arguments. "Of course you'd say that, Thessaly. Of course you'd assume I'm going to fail." I felt that familiar tightness in my chest, the one that always appeared when Sandra's mood turned dark. Our father, Caspian Rothwell, cleared his throat in that particular way that meant he was preparing to mediate, while our mother, Delphine, set down her newspaper and assumed the expression of careful neutrality she'd perfected over decades of managing our family dynamics. "That's not what I meant," I said carefully, trying to keep my voice level. "I was just suggesting practical considerations. Financial security while you're getting established." Sandra laughed, but there was no humor in it. The sound was sharp and bitter, cutting through the morning quiet like broken glass. "Financial security, right, because you're such an expert on building something from scratch." The accusation stung because it carried just enough truth to land. I'd taken the safe route after college, accepting a position at our father's accounting firm, working my way up through familiar structures rather than venturing into unknown territory. It was a choice I'd made deliberately, valuing stability over uncertainty. But Sandra had always viewed it as evidence of my fundamental lack of courage. "I'm not trying to criticize you," I insisted, though I could hear the defensiveness creeping into my voice despite my best efforts. "I'm trying to be helpful." "Helpful?" Sandra turned the word over like she was examining a particularly unpleasant specimen. "The way you helped when I was considering the art therapy program, or when I wanted to move to Portland? You've never believed in anything I've wanted to do, Thessaly. Not once." This was dangerous territory. We were venturing into the accumulated grievances of nearly 3 decades, the careful inventory of perceived slights and misunderstandings that Sandra had been cataloging since we were children. I could see our parents exchanging the kind of meaningful look that married couples develop, the silent communication that conveyed volumes about their shared experience of navigating our relationship. "That's not fair," I said, though I kept my voice quiet. "I've always supported you. Maybe I haven't always agreed with every decision, but that doesn't mean I don't believe in you." "Doesn't it?" Sandra's eyes were bright with unshed tears, but there was something else there too. Something that looked almost like triumph, as if she'd been waiting for exactly this moment to present her case. When have you ever, even once, told me that you thought I was making the right choice? When have you ever said that you believed I could succeed at something? The question hung in the air between us, heavy with accumulated hurt. I wanted to argue, to point out all the times I'd offered encouragement, all the conversations where I'd tried to be supportive while also being realistic. But as I searched my memory, I realized with growing discomfort that Sandra might have a point. My support had always come with qualifications, my encouragement tempered by practical concerns. "I worry about you," I said finally, the admission feeling like a small surrender. "I don't want to see you get hurt." Hurt by what? By trying? By taking risks? By refusing to settle for the safe, boring life you've chosen? Sandra's voice was rising now, drawing concerned glances from our parents. "You think your way is so much better. But look at you, Thessaly. You're 31 years old, living in the same town where you grew up, working for our father, dating the same man you've been with since college. When was the last time you took a real risk? When was the last time you wanted something enough to fight for it?" Each word hit like a carefully aimed arrow, finding its target in the soft spots of my own insecurities. The life she was describing sounded small and safe when filtered through her contempt, stripped of the contentment and security I'd worked so hard to build. "There's nothing wrong with stability," I said, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. "Not everyone needs to reinvent themselves every 2 years." It was the wrong thing to say. I knew it the moment the words left my mouth, but it was too late to call them back. Sandra's face went very still, and I saw something shift in her expression that made my stomach drop. "Every 2 years," she repeated slowly. "Is that how you see it? Like I'm some kind of flighty child who can't stick with anything? Sandra, that's not... No, I think it is exactly what you meant." She was moving now, pacing around the breakfast nook with the restless energy of a caged animal. "You think I'm irresponsible? You think I'm immature? You think I can't be trusted to make adult decisions about my own life?" Our parents were watching this exchange with the careful attention of people who'd witnessed similar scenes before, but there was something different about this one. Usually, our arguments followed predictable patterns, escalating to a certain point before one of us backed down or our parents intervened. This felt different, more dangerous. "I think you're impulsive," I said, trying to find some middle ground that might diffuse the situation. "I think you make decisions based on emotion rather than logic, and sometimes that leads to complications." The words were barely out of my mouth when Sandra stopped pacing and turned to face me fully. Her expression was perfectly calm now, which somehow felt more frightening than her earlier agitation. "Impulsive," she said, nodding slowly. "Emotional. Illogical. Tell me, Thessaly, how exactly do you think I should live my life? What would meet your standards for responsible adult behavior?" There was a trap in the question, but I couldn't see how to avoid it. "I just think you could benefit from more planning, from considering long-term consequences before making major changes." "Like you do." "Yes, like I do." Sandra smiled then, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. "And you think that makes you better than me?" "I don't think I'm better than you. I think we're different people with different approaches to life." "Different approaches." She tasted the phrase like it was bitter medicine. "That's a very diplomatic way to put it. Very safe." The emphasis she placed on the last word made it sound like an accusation. Before I could respond, she continued, her voice taking on a tone I'd never heard before, something cold and calculating that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. You know what I think, Thessaly? I think you're scared. I think you spent so much time playing it safe that you've forgotten how to want anything real. I think you judge my choices because they remind you of everything you're too afraid to try. That's not true, I said, but even to my own ears, the denial sounded weak, isn't it? When was the last time you did something that scared you? When was the last time you took a chance on something that mattered? I wanted to argue, to defend the choices I'd made and the life I'd built, but something about the way she was looking at me, something about the absolute certainty in her voice, made the words stick in my throat. I thought so, Sandra said when I didn't immediately respond. You know what the really sad part is? You could have been supportive. You could have chosen to believe in me, to trust that maybe I know what I'm doing. But instead, you chose to be another voice telling me why I'm wrong, why I should be more careful, why I should be more like you. Sandra, no, I'm done listening to your advice. I'm done pretending that your opinion matters to me. I'm done letting you make me feel small and stupid and irresponsible just because I refuse to live your boring, colorless life. She was standing near the kitchen counter now, close to where our mother kept her hair styling tools in a small basket. The morning light from the window caught the silver of the hairdryer's handle, making it gleam like a weapon. I didn't think anything of it at first. Why would I? It was just a hairdryer, just another ordinary object in our parents' familiar kitchen. You think you're so much smarter than everyone else? Sandra continued, her voice getting louder again. You think your careful, calculated approach to everything makes you superior. But you know what it really makes you? It makes you nothing. It makes you a person who's never really lived, never really tried, never really risked anything that mattered. That's enough, our father said, finally stepping in. His voice carried the authority that had kept our family in line for decades, but Sandra barely seemed to hear him. Is it enough? She asked, turning to look at him briefly before focusing back on me. Is it enough that your precious older daughter has spent her entire adult life in a bubble of safety and security while looking down on everyone who dares to take a real chance? Sandra, please, our mother said, her voice carrying a note of warning that I recognized from our childhood. This is getting out of hand. Out of hand? Sandra laughed again, that same sharp, bitter sound. No, I don't think so. I think this is exactly where it needed to go. I think it's time Thessaly heard some truth about herself. I stood up from the table, suddenly feeling like I needed to remove myself from the situation before it escalated further. The kitchen felt too small, too charged with emotions that were spiraling beyond anyone's control. I think we should both take some time to cool down, I said, trying to inject some calm into the situation. We can talk about this later when we're not so what? So emotional, so impulsive? Sandra's voice was rising to a pitch that made me genuinely concerned about her state of mind. There you go again, Thessaly, always trying to manage everyone else's feelings, always trying to control the situation. She moved closer to me, and I could see that her hands were shaking, not with fear or sadness, but with a kind of rage that I'd never seen in her before. It was pure and focused and absolutely terrifying. You want to know what I really think about your advice? She said, her voice dropping back to that dangerous whisper. I think you can take your backup plans and your financial security and your careful, boring life and the rest of her sentence was lost as she reached for something on the counter. The movement was so fast, so unexpected, that I didn't have time to process what was happening until it was too late. One moment she was standing there, spitting words at me like bullets, and the next she was swinging our mother's hairdryer at my head with all the force she could muster. The impact was stunning in its completeness. I felt the hard plastic connect with my skull just above my left temple, heard the sickening crack of the collision, felt my vision explode into white stars before everything went dark around the edges. The force of the blow sent me stumbling backward, my legs tangling with the kitchen chair as I lost my balance and went down hard. I hit the floor with my shoulder first, then my head bounced against the hardwood with a sound that seemed to echo through the kitchen like a gunshot. For a moment, everything was silent. No one moved, no one spoke, no one seemed to breathe. Then the pain started, radiating out from the point of impact in waves that made my vision blur and my stomach turn. I could feel something warm and wet trickling down the side of my face, and when I touched my hand to my temple, it came away bright red with blood. The sight of it seemed to break the spell that had fallen over the kitchen, and suddenly everyone was moving and talking at once. "Oh my God," our mother gasped, her voice high and strange. "Oh my God, Sandra, what have you done?" "I didn't mean—" Sandra's voice sounded small and far away, completely different from the angry woman who'd been attacking me moments before. "I didn't mean to hit her that hard." "That hard?" Our father's voice was sharp with disbelief. "You hit her with a hairdryer, Sandra." "What did you think was going to happen?" I tried to sit up, but the movement made my head spin so violently that I had to lie back down again. The bleeding seemed to be getting worse, and I could feel panic starting to creep in around the edges of my consciousness. "I need to go to the hospital," I said, though my voice sounded strange and thick to my own ears. "I think I might have a concussion." "No," our father said quickly, his tone brooking no argument. "No hospitals. We're not involving outsiders in family business." I blinked up at him, trying to process what he'd just said. "Dad, I'm bleeding. I need medical attention." "You'll be fine," he insisted, but I could see the worry in his eyes, even as he tried to sound authoritative. "Head wounds always bleed, more than they should. It looks worse than it is." "It doesn't feel worse than it is," I said, struggling to keep my voice level despite the pain that was making it hard to think clearly. "It feels like I've been hit in the head with a hairdryer." I reached for my phone, which had fallen out of my pocket when I went down. My plan was simple: call 911, get the medical help I clearly needed, and deal with the family dynamics later. But as soon as my fingers closed around the device, our father stepped forward and took it from my hand. "What are you doing?" I asked, genuinely confused by his behavior. "I told you, no outside interference," he said, slipping my phone into his own pocket. "We handle our problems internally." "This isn't a family problem, Dad. This is a medical emergency." I was starting to feel dizzy again, and the bleeding didn't seem to be slowing down. "I need professional medical care." "You need to stop being dramatic," our mother said, her voice carrying that tone of irritated dismissal that I remembered from childhood injuries. "Sandra barely touched you." I stared at her in disbelief. "Barely touched me? I'm bleeding, Mom. I'm probably concussed. She hit me with a hairdryer hard enough to knock me down." "You're exaggerating," she insisted, though she wouldn't meet my eyes. You always did have a flair for the dramatic when you got hurt. The unfairness of this characterization hit me almost as hard as the hairdryer had. I'd never been the dramatic child. That had always been Sandra's role in our family dynamic. I was the responsible one, the practical one, the one who handled pain and disappointment with quiet dignity. I'm not exaggerating, I said, forcing myself to sit up despite the wave of nausea that accompanied the movement. Look at me. Look at the blood. This is real. But even as I spoke, I could see that they'd already made up their minds. Whatever was happening here, whatever family crisis Sandra's attack had triggered, they were more concerned about protecting the family image than ensuring my well-being. Sandra didn't mean to hurt you, our mother continued, her voice taking on the soothing tone she used when she was trying to smooth over family conflicts. It was an accident. She was upset, and things got out of hand. An accident? I looked over at Sandra, who was standing near the kitchen sink with tears streaming down her face. Was it an accident, Sandra? Did you accidentally pick up that hairdryer and accidentally swing it at my head? She didn't answer, just continued crying in that silent, dramatic way that had always been her specialty. I realized that once again, she was managing to be the victim in a situation where she'd been the aggressor. This is ridiculous, I said, struggling to my feet despite my parents' protests. I'm going to drive myself to the emergency room. No, you're not, our mother said firmly, stepping between me and the door. You're in no condition to drive. You could hurt someone. Then drive me yourself, I said, my patience finally beginning to fray. Or let me call an ambulance. But I'm getting medical attention one way or another. Thessaly, please, our father said, his voice taking on a pleading quality that I'd rarely heard from him. Just sit down for a minute. Let's all take a breath and figure this out calmly. Figure what out? I asked, pressing my hand to my temple where the bleeding continued. There's nothing to figure out. I've been assaulted by my sister, and I need medical care. It's really that simple. Assaulted is a very strong word, our mother said carefully. This was a family disagreement that got a little heated. These things happen. These things don't happen in normal families, I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. Normal sisters don't attack each other with appliances. Normal parents don't prevent their injured children from getting medical help. We're not preventing anything, our father insisted. We're just asking you to think about the consequences of involving outsiders in our personal business. I stared at him, trying to understand what he was really saying. What consequences? What are you worried about? The look he exchanged with our mother told me everything I needed to know. They weren't worried about my health or my well-being. They were worried about what people would think. They were worried about their reputation, about having to explain to their friends and neighbors and colleagues that their younger daughter had violently attacked their older daughter over a breakfast table argument. I'm going to my car, I said, moving toward the door despite the way the room seemed to tilt around me. If you won't help me, I'll help myself. But when I reached for my keys, which I'd left on the small table by the kitchen door, our mother's hand closed over mine. I can't let you drive in your condition, she said, and there was genuine concern in her voice for the first time since the attack. You're clearly not thinking straight. I'm thinking perfectly straight, I said, though the continued bleeding and the pounding in my head suggested otherwise. I'm thinking that I need medical attention, and my family is trying to prevent me from getting it. We're trying to protect you, she insisted, from making a decision you might regret later. The only decision I regret is coming to breakfast this morning, I said, trying to pull my keys from her grasp. Now let me go. No, she said firmly, closing her fist around my keys. I won't be responsible for letting you drive when you're clearly injured and upset. The irony of this statement wasn't lost on me. She wouldn't be responsible for letting me drive to get medical help, but she was perfectly comfortable being responsible for preventing me from getting that help in the first place. Then you drive me, I said, though I could already see the refusal forming in her expression. I think you're overreacting, she said. Head wounds always look worse than they are because they bleed so much. You probably just need some ice and a few stitches. A few stitches that I can only get at a hospital, I pointed out. Or from Dr. Whitmore down the street, our father suggested. He's practically family, very discreet. The suggestion that they'd rather have a family friend provide substandard medical care in order to avoid any official record of what had happened was the final straw. I realized that my parents were more concerned about potential embarrassment than about my actual welfare, and the understanding hit me like a second blow to the head. This is insane, I said, though my voice was getting weaker as the adrenaline began to wear off and the full impact of my injury made itself known. You're all acting insane. We're acting like a family, our mother said, her voice carrying that sanctimonious tone that had always made me want to scream. Families protect each other. They don't air their problems in public. Even when those problems involve violence? I asked. Even when someone gets hurt? Especially then, our father said quietly, and something in his tone made me look at him more carefully. There was something in his expression that I couldn't quite read, something that suggested this wasn't the first time our family had dealt with a situation like this. The thought sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with my injury. Has this happened before? I asked, the question emerging before I'd fully formed the thought. Has Sandra hurt someone before? The silence that followed my question was answer enough. I looked from one parent to the other, seeing guilt and fear and a kind of weary resignation that spoke volumes about family secrets I'd never suspected. Who? I asked, though part of me didn't want to know the answer. It doesn't matter, our mother said quickly. That's not what we're dealing with now. It matters to me, I said, pressing my hand more firmly against my temple as the bleeding seemed to intensify. If my sister has a history of violence, I need to know about it. She doesn't have a history of violence, our father said, but his tone suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as me. She has a history of emotional outbursts. Sometimes people get hurt when emotions run high. Sometimes people get hurt, I repeated slowly. That's how you're characterizing assault with a deadly weapon? A hairdryer isn't a deadly weapon, our mother protested. It is when you swing it at someone's head hard enough to cause a concussion and significant bleeding, I said. It is when you use it with the intent to cause harm. I was starting to feel lightheaded, and I realized that I needed to take action soon before I lost the capacity to act at all. The bleeding hadn't stopped, and my vision was becoming increasingly blurry around the edges. I'm leaving, I announced, taking a step toward the door, with or without my keys, with or without your permission. I'm getting medical help. Thessaly, please. Sandra spoke for the first time since the attack, her voice small and broken. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to hurt you so badly. I turned to look at her, this woman who'd shared a childhood with me, who'd been my closest companion through our teenage years, who'd become a stranger I no longer recognized. But you did mean to hurt me, I said quietly. You picked up that hairdryer with the specific intention of causing me pain. The only thing you're sorry about is that you hit me harder than you planned." "That's not true," she protested, but her denial lacked conviction. "Isn't it? You told me exactly what you thought of me and my life. You told me I was nothing, that I'd never really lived. And when words weren't enough to express your contempt, you decided to use violence." "I was angry," she said, as if that explained everything. "So was I replied, "but I didn't hit you with anything. I didn't try to cause you physical harm. Being angry doesn't justify what you did." "She knows that," our father interjected. "Don't you, Sandra? You know what you did was wrong." Sandra nodded miserably, but I could see that her agreement was more about appeasing our parents than genuine remorse. She was sorry she'd been caught, sorry she'd caused a family crisis, but she wasn't sorry she'd tried to hurt me. "I need my keys," I said, holding out my hand to our mother. "I need to leave now." "You're not thinking clearly," she insisted. "Let us take care of this. Let us handle the situation." "The way you handled whatever happened before?" I asked, and I saw her flinch at the accuracy of my guess. "How many times has this happened? How many times have you covered up for her?" "That's not fair," our father said. "Sandra has been getting help. She's been working on her anger management." "Clearly it's not working," I said, gesturing to my bleeding head. "And clearly none of you learned anything from whatever previous incident you're trying so hard not to talk about." I was getting angrier now, which probably wasn't helping my injury, but I couldn't seem to stop myself. The realization that my family had been hiding Sandra's violent tendencies, that they'd chosen to protect her reputation over other people's safety, was more shocking than the attack itself. "We learned that family business should stay in the family," our mother said firmly. "We learned that involving outsiders only makes things worse." "Worse for whom?" I asked. "Worse for Sandra? Worse for your reputation? Or worse for whoever she decides to attack next time?" "There won't be a next time," our father said, but his voice lacked conviction. "How can you possibly guarantee that?" I asked. "She just demonstrated that she's willing to use violence when she gets angry enough. What happens the next time someone disagrees with her? What happens when she has this kind of outburst with someone who isn't family?" The question hung in the air between us, unanswered, because there was no good answer. They couldn't guarantee Sandra's future behavior any more than they could undo what had just happened. "I'm taking my keys," I said, reaching for our mother's closed fist, "and I'm leaving. You can choose to support me or not, but you can't stop me." "Yes, we can," our father said quietly, and something in his tone made me look at him more carefully. There was a determination in his expression that I'd never seen before, a kind of desperate resolve that suggested he was prepared to do whatever it took to prevent me from leaving. The realization that my own father might be willing to physically restrain me to protect my sister's secret was almost more than I could process. "You're going to hold me here against my will?" I asked, hardly believing the words even as I spoke them. "We're going to prevent you from making a mistake you'll regret," he said. "Sometimes parents have to make difficult decisions to protect their children." From what? From getting medical care? From reporting a crime? From destroying their family over a momentary lapse in judgment? Our mother said, her voice taking on that pleading quality that had always been her most effective manipulation tool. But I was beyond being manipulated. The pain in my head was getting worse, not better, and I was beginning to suspect that my injury might be more serious than any of us had initially realized. The thought that my family would prioritize their image over my health was clarifying in a way that nothing else could have been. "Let me ask you something," I said, looking each of them in the eye. "If this had happened to someone else's daughter, if Sandra had attacked a stranger this way, what would you expect that person's family to do?" The question clearly made them uncomfortable, but no one answered. "You'd expect them to call the police," I continued. "You'd expect them to press charges. You'd expect them to make sure Sandra faced consequences for her actions. But because I'm family, because keeping your secret is more important than my well-being, you expect me to just accept it." "It's not about keeping secrets," our father protested. "It's about handling things appropriately." "Appropriately for whom?" I asked, because this doesn't feel very appropriate from where I'm standing. I was starting to feel genuinely dizzy now, and I realized that I was running out of time to take action. Whatever was happening with my injury, it was getting worse, not better, and I needed professional medical attention sooner rather than later. "I'm going to give you one more chance," I said, trying to project more strength than I actually felt. "Help me get to a hospital, or I'll find another way to get there. But either way, I'm leaving this house in the next 5 minutes." "And if you do," our father said quietly, "you'll be choosing to destroy this family. You'll be choosing to prioritize your own interests over everyone else's well-being." The accusation hit me like another blow, this one aimed at my sense of loyalty and family obligation. But I realized that what he was really asking me to do was to sacrifice my own health and safety to protect Sandra from the consequences of her choices. "No," I said, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. "I'll be choosing to prioritize my own well-being over your reputation. There's a difference." The standoff continued for another moment, but I could see that they weren't going to relent. My parents had made their choice, and it wasn't me. They decided that protecting Sandra's secret was more important than ensuring I received proper medical care, and nothing I could say was going to change their minds. "Fine," I said, turning toward the back door. "I'll walk to the hospital if I have to." But even as I spoke, I was calculating distances and trying to figure out if I was in any condition to walk the 3 miles to the nearest emergency room. The bleeding hadn't stopped. My vision was getting increasingly blurry, and I was starting to feel nauseous in a way that suggested a significant head injury. What I couldn't have predicted, what none of us could have anticipated, was what I was going to discover during that walk, what I was going to learn about my family, about myself, and about the choices that had brought us to this moment. The decision I would make in exactly 3 hours would change everything. But as I reached for the door handle, I had no idea that the worst part of this day was still ahead of me. The back door opened easily under my hand, and I stepped out into the hairdryer, cool morning air that felt like freedom after the suffocating atmosphere of the kitchen. Behind me, I could hear my parents arguing with Sandra in urgent whispers, but their words were lost in the rushing sound that had started in my ears. Whether it was from the head injury or the adrenaline crash, I wasn't sure, but everything seemed to be happening from a great distance now. The walk to the hospital should have taken 45 minutes under normal circumstances, but I quickly realized that my condition was going to make the journey significantly more challenging. After just 2 blocks, I had to stop and lean against the mailbox while the world tilted around me in a way that made my stomach lurch. The bleeding from my temple had slowed but not stopped, and I could feel dried blood flaking off my skin every time I moved my head. "Mrs. Pemberton from 3 houses down was working in her garden and looked up as I passed, her expression shifting from friendly recognition to alarm when she saw the blood on my face. "Thessaly, dear, what on earth happened to you?" she called out, setting down her pruning shears and hurrying toward her front gate. "I had an accident," I said, the lie coming easier than I'd expected. Already, I was beginning to understand the gravitational pull of family secrets, the way they bent truth around them until even the victims found themselves protecting their attackers. "You need medical attention," she said, her voice filled with genuine concern. "Would you like me to drive you somewhere?" The offer was so kind, so normal, that it almost made me cry. Here was a neighbor, practically a stranger, showing more concern for my well-being than my own family had managed. "I would be so grateful," I said, and within minutes I was sitting in her comfortable sedan, trying not to bleed on her upholstery while she navigated the morning traffic toward Riverside General Hospital. Mrs. Pemberton was the kind of person who respected privacy, asking no probing questions about how I'd been injured or why I was walking to the hospital alone instead of being driven by family. She chatted pleasantly about her garden and the weather, giving me space to process what had happened while ensuring I stayed conscious during the drive. The emergency room was exactly what I'd expected. Fluorescent lights that made everything look harsh and unforgiving, the smell of disinfectant mixing with the underlying sense of human suffering and industrial cleaning products. The triage nurse took one look at my bloodied temple and moved me quickly through the initial assessment process. Head trauma, possible concussion, laceration requiring sutures, she noted on her chart. "How did this happen?" "I was hit with a hairdryer," I said, the words sounding surreal even to my own ears. The nurse's expression didn't change, but I saw her make a note that seemed longer than my simple explanation warranted. "Hit by whom?" "My sister." Another note, this one accompanied by a meaningful look that I couldn't quite interpret. Was this intentional? The question hung in the air between us, heavy with implications I wasn't ready to fully confront. "Yes," I said finally. She was angry about something I said. "I see. Are you safe now? Is there anyone who might try to prevent you from receiving medical care or who might retaliate against you for seeking help?" The question was so precisely targeted that it took my breath away. How did she know to ask exactly that? Had she seen cases like this before? "My family wants to handle this privately," I said carefully. "They don't want me to involve outsiders." The nurse nodded as if this was exactly what she'd expected to hear. "Mr. Thessaly, I want you to know that you have the right to receive medical care regardless of what anyone else wants. You also have the right to report this incident to law enforcement if you choose to do so." "I know," I said, though I wasn't sure I really did know. The past few hours had shown me how quickly familiar ground could become foreign territory. "I'm going to have Dr. Martinez examine you," she continued. "She's very experienced with head injuries, and she's also someone you can talk to if you have concerns about your safety or your family situation." "Doctor?" Martinez turned out to be a woman in her early 50s with kind eyes and gentle hands. She examined my injury with thorough professionalism, cleaning the wound and preparing to suture it while asking detailed questions about the incident. "This is a significant laceration," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "The object that caused it was swung with considerable force. You're fortunate it didn't cause more serious damage." "How much more serious?" I asked, suddenly wondering what might have happened if Sandra had struck me at a slightly different angle. Skull fracture, brain hemorrhage, permanent cognitive impairment, Dr. Martinez said matter-of-factly. Head injuries are unpredictable. What seems minor can become life-threatening very quickly. As she worked on my sutures, she continued talking in that same careful tone. Have you experienced anything like this before? Any previous incidents of violence from family members? No, I said, then hesitated. But I think there might have been other incidents involving my sister. My parents made some comments that suggested this isn't the first time something like this has happened. Dr. Martinez's hands paused in their work for just a moment. Other incidents involving your sister and other people? I think so. They seem very concerned about keeping this quiet, about not involving authorities or outsiders. They acted like they had experience managing this kind of situation. I see. Doctor. Martinez finished the last suture and began applying a dressing to the wound. Thessaly, what I'm about to tell you might be difficult to hear, but I think you need to know. 3 years ago, a young woman named Cordelia Thorne was brought to this emergency room with injuries very similar to yours. The words hit me like cold water. Similar how? Laceration to the head, caused by a blunt object wielded with significant force. The patient reported that she'd been attacked by someone named Sandra during an argument. She said it was a family friend who'd become violent when challenged about her behavior. My hand started shaking. What happened to her? She received medical treatment and was discharged. She told the staff she intended to file a police report, but as far as I know, no charges were ever filed. When I followed up a few weeks later, she said the matter had been resolved privately and she didn't want to discuss it further. Doctor, Martinez moved to sit in the chair across from the examination table, her expression serious. 2 months after that, we treated a young man named Marcus Whitfield for a broken wrist and facial contusions. He also reported being attacked by someone named Sandra, this time at what he described as a wellness retreat she was running. The pieces were starting to come together in a way that made me feel sick. Did he file charges? He intended to, but the next day he came back and said he'd changed his mind. He'd spoken with Sandra's family, and they'd convinced him it would be better to handle things privately. He seemed nervous, kept looking over his shoulder like he was worried about being seen here. How many others have there been? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Those are the only 2 cases I'm personally aware of, but I've only been at this hospital for 4 years. There could be others, either here or at other facilities. Dr. Martinez leaned forward, her expression intense. Thessaly, what you're describing is a pattern of violence that's being systematically covered up. Your sister has seriously injured multiple people, and your family has been using their influence and resources to prevent any legal consequences. But why would the victims agree to stay quiet? I asked, though even as I spoke, I was beginning to understand. Money, usually, sometimes threats, though those are harder to prove. Often it's a combination of both. A generous settlement offer accompanied by warnings about what might happen if they don't accept it. The implications were staggering. My family wasn't just covering up Sandra's violence, they were actively participating in a conspiracy to obstruct justice. They were paying victims to stay silent and potentially intimidating them to ensure their compliance. What should I do? I asked, feeling overwhelmed by the scope of what Dr. Martinez was revealing. That depends on what you can live with, she said gently. You could accept whatever settlement your family offers and pretend this never happened. Many people make that choice, and I understand why. It's the path of least resistance. Or Or you could choose to break the pattern. You could refuse to be silenced and insist that your sister face real consequences for her actions. But you need to understand that if you make that choice, you'll be going against your family's interests, and they may not forgive you for it. I sat in that sterile examination room thinking about Cordelia Thorne and Marcus Whitfield and whoever else might have suffered at my sister's hands. I thought about my parents' desperate attempts to prevent me from seeking medical care, their willingness to prioritize Sandra's reputation over my well-being. "Can you tell me how to contact the other victims?" I asked. "Doctor," Martinez smiled for the first time since she'd begun her revelations. "I can't give you their contact information directly, but I can tell you that Cordelia Thorne works at the regional library downtown. And Marcus Whitfield is a yoga instructor at the Wellness Center on Maple Street." She handed me her business card. "If you decide you want to pursue this, call me. I'll help however I can. But think carefully about what you're willing to risk before you make any irreversible decisions." The taxi ride back to my parents' neighborhood gave me time to process everything Dr. Martinez had told me. By the time I arrived at the house, I'd made my decision. Instead of going inside to face my family's questions and manipulations, I walked to the public library downtown. Cordelia Thorne was easy to find. She was working at the reference desk, a woman about my age with prematurely gray hair and a scar along her left temple that was eerily similar to the one I now sported. When I introduced myself and explained why I was there, her expression went through a series of changes: recognition, fear, anger, and finally a kind of weary resignation. "I wondered if this day would come," she said quietly, glancing around to make sure we weren't being overheard, "when someone else would get hurt badly enough that they wouldn't just accept the family's hush money." "They offered you money?" $50,000 to sign a non-disclosure agreement and promised not to file charges, she said matter-of-factly. It seemed like a fortune to someone my age, especially someone who'd just graduated college with significant student loan debt. "But you took it." "I took it," she confirmed, and I could hear the shame in her voice. I told myself I was being practical, that putting Sandra in jail wouldn't undo what she'd done to me. But the truth is, I was scared. Scared of what? Cordelia looked around again, then lowered her voice. "Your father made it very clear that if I didn't accept their offer, things could become difficult for me. He mentioned that he had connections in the business community, that he could make it hard for me to find employment. He suggested that my family might face similar challenges if I insisted on making trouble. The picture that was emerging of my family was becoming more disturbing by the minute. They weren't just covering up Sandra's violence, they were actively threatening and intimidating her victims." "What exactly happened between you and Sandra?" I asked. "I attended one of her wellness workshops," Cordelia explained. She was calling herself a life transformation specialist at the time. During the session, she had us doing these emotional exercises where we were supposed to confront our limiting beliefs about ourselves. And I questioned one of her techniques. I have a psychology degree, and what she was doing seemed potentially harmful to people with trauma histories. I suggested she might want to consider some additional training or certification. Cordelia touched her temple unconsciously. She completely lost control, started screaming that I was undermining her authority, that I was trying to sabotage her business. When I tried to leave, she grabbed a wooden meditation bowl and threw it at my head. The similarities to my own experience were chilling. Sandra's pattern seemed to be consistent: become violent when challenged or criticized, then rely on family resources to manage the consequences. Have you had any contact with her since? None. The non-disclosure agreement prohibits me from discussing what happened or having any interaction with her or her family. Cordelia looked at me meaningfully. Technically, I'm violating that agreement by talking to you right now. I'm sorry, I said, suddenly understanding the risk she was taking. I didn't realize. Don't apologize, she interrupted. I've regretted taking their money every day for 3 years. If there's finally a chance to do the right thing, I want to be part of it. Marcus Whitfield was equally willing to talk, though his story was even more disturbing than Cordelia's. He'd been hired to teach yoga classes at one of Sandra's wellness retreats, and she'd attacked him when he'd refused her sexual advances. She said I was rejecting her because I thought I was better than her, he explained as we sat in the small cafe near his yoga studio. When I tried to explain that I was in a committed relationship and wasn't interested in anyone else, she became enraged. What did she do? She picked up a ceramic vase from the retreat center's lobby and threw it at me. When I ducked, she grabbed my wrist and twisted it until it broke. Then she kicked me in the face while I was on the ground. Marcus showed me his left wrist, which was visibly misshapen despite the medical treatment he'd received. I lost range of motion permanently. It ended my plans to become a professional yoga instructor. And your family offered you money too? $75,000, he said bitterly. Plus they arranged for me to receive ongoing medical treatment from a private doctor who wouldn't ask questions about how I'd been injured. But you didn't want to take it? I wanted to see her prosecuted. I wanted her to face consequences for what she'd done. But your parents made it clear that wasn't going to happen. They had photographs of me from the retreat that could be taken out of context. They suggested that if I insisted on pressing charges, those photos might find their way to my employer and my family. The web of intimidation and manipulation my family had constructed around Sandra's violence was becoming clearer, and it was far more sophisticated than I'd initially realized. They weren't just offering money, they were creating leverage through blackmail and threats. There's something else, Marcus said hesitantly. Something I never told anyone because I wasn't sure if it was real or if I'd imagined it because of the concussion. What? While I was on the ground after she attacked me, Sandra stood over me and said something that didn't make sense at the time. She said, "Now you know what happens when people don't respect me. Ask Judith if you don't believe me." Who's Judith? I have no idea, but the way she said it, like she was referencing something that had happened before, something worse than what she'd just done to me. I felt a chill run down my spine. If there was another victim, someone whose case had been serious enough that Sandra used it as a threat, then the scope of this conspiracy was even larger than I'd imagined. Have you tried to find this Judith person? I searched online, looked through local news reports, but I never found anything. Your family is very good at keeping their secrets. By the time I left Marcus, it was almost noon, and I realized that 3 hours had passed since I'd walked out of my parents' house. I had enough information now to understand that Sandra's attack on me wasn't an isolated incident or a momentary lapse in judgment. It was part of a pattern of violence that my family had been enabling and covering up for years. But I still needed to find Judith, whoever she was. If Sandra was using her as a threat, if her case was serious enough to intimidate other victims into silence, then she might be the key to understanding the full extent of what my family had been hiding. I drove to the main branch of the city library, hoping their newspaper archives might contain some trace of Judith's story. The librarian on duty was helpful, but puzzled when I explained that I was looking for news stories about someone named Judith who might have been involved in an incident with my sister, but I couldn't provide a time frame or surname. "Do you have any other details?" she asked. "The nature of the incident, approximate date, anything that might help narrow the search?" "It would have been something that required medical attention," I said carefully. "Probably something serious enough that it might have made the local news." She showed me how to use the digital archive system, and I spent the next hour searching through years of local news reports for any mention of someone named Judith who'd been injured under circumstances that might involve Sandra. The search was frustrating and largely fruitless until I remembered something Marcus had said about Sandra's wellness retreats. I refined my search to focus on stories about accidents or incidents at wellness centers, spas, or retreat facilities in the surrounding area. That's when I found it, buried in a brief news report from 6 years ago. "Local woman hospitalized after retreat accident," read the headline of a story that was barely 3 paragraphs long. According to the report, Judith Calloway, age 24, had been hospitalized with severe head trauma after what was described as an accident involving falling objects at a mindfulness retreat center outside the city. The article mentioned that Judith had been in a coma for several days before regaining consciousness, and that she'd suffered permanent cognitive impairment as a result of her injuries. The retreat center had declined to comment on the incident, citing ongoing legal proceedings. I searched for follow-up stories, but found nothing. No resolution to the legal proceedings, no updates on Judith's condition, no further mention of the retreat center. It was as if the story had simply vanished from public record after that initial report. But I had a name now, and a general time frame. A few more searches revealed that Judith Calloway lived in an assisted living facility about 20 minutes from the city center. According to the facility's website, they specialized in caring for adults with traumatic brain injuries. The Sunshine Manor was a pleasant-looking building surrounded by well-maintained gardens, but there was something heartbreaking about knowing that people lived there, not by choice, but because their injuries had made independent living impossible. When I explained to the front desk that I was hoping to visit Judith Calloway, the receptionist looked concerned. "Are you family?" she asked. "Judith doesn't get many visitors, and we have to be careful about who we allow to see our residents." "I'm not family," I said honestly, "but I think we might have been injured by the same person." "I'm trying to understand what happened to her." The receptionist's expression changed. "Let me get Mrs. Patterson, our social worker. She handles situations like this." Mrs. Patterson was a middle-aged woman with a kind of patient, gentle demeanor that suggested years of experience dealing with difficult circumstances. When I explained my situation, she listened carefully before responding. "Judith's case was particularly tragic," she said. "She was a graduate student in psychology before her injury. Very bright, very promising future. Now she has the cognitive function of a 12-year-old child." "What exactly happened to her?" Mrs. Patterson hesitated. "Officially, it was ruled an accident. Judith was participating in what was called an intensive emotional breakthrough session when a wooden sculpture allegedly fell from a shelf and struck her head." Allegedly? Judith's memory of the incident is fragmentary, but what she does doesn't match the official story. She insists that someone threw something at her during an argument, but her testimony was deemed unreliable due to her brain injury. I felt sick. This was what Sandra had done when her violence escalated beyond what could be covered up with simple payoffs and threats. She'd permanently disabled someone, destroyed their life and future, and my family had managed to make it disappear from public record. "Can I see her?" I asked. Mrs. Patterson studied my face carefully. "I can't make that decision for her, but I can ask if she's willing to meet with you. She's having a good day today, which means her communication skills are functioning better than usual." Judith Calloway was sitting in the facility's garden, working on what appeared to be a simple jigsaw puzzle. She looked younger than her 30 years, with the kind of innocent expression that often accompanied certain types of brain injury. When Mrs. Patterson introduced us, Judith looked up with curious but trusting eyes. "You're hurt too," she said immediately, noticing the bandage on my temple. "Someone hurt you the way they hurt me." "Yes," I said gently. "Someone named Sandra." Judith's entire demeanor changed at the mention of the name. Her face clouded with confusion and fear, and she began rocking slightly in her chair. "Sandra was angry," she said, her voice taking on the cadence of a much younger person. "I said something wrong, and she got so angry. She threw the statue at me, and then everything went dark." "What did you say that made her angry?" I told her that her therapy techniques weren't safe. I said she needed more training before she tried to help people with their trauma. She screamed at me that I was trying to ruin her business. The story was heartbreakingly familiar, but the consequences had been catastrophic. Where Cordelia and Marcus and I had suffered injuries that would heal, Judith had lost her entire future. "Did your family try to help you get justice?" I asked. Judith's expression became confused. "My parents died in a car accident when I was 22. I don't have any family to help me. The nice lawyers said it was better to settle, that going to court would be too stressful for someone with my condition." I realized that Judith had been the perfect victim from my family's perspective. No advocates to fight for her. No one to question the settlement terms or demand a real investigation. They'd been able to silence her completely while ensuring she received just enough care to keep her alive and comfortable. "How much did they pay you?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. "They pay for me to live here," Judith said simply. "The lawyers said it was a very generous settlement, enough to take care of me for the rest of my life, but I don't understand why they won't let me talk about what happened." The full scope of my family's conspiracy was finally becoming clear. They'd found a way to bury Judith's case completely, turning her settlement into ongoing payments that bought their silence while keeping her out of the public eye. She wasn't just a victim who'd been paid off. She was essentially being held in comfortable captivity. "Judith," I said carefully, "how would you feel about telling your story to the police? About making sure people know what really happened to you?" Her face lit up with an expression of hope that broke my heart. Could I do that? "The lawyers always said I couldn't talk about it, that it would be breaking the rules." "You can talk about whatever you want," I assured her. "No one has the right to prevent you from telling the truth about what happened to you." As I drove away from Sunshine Manor, I felt the weight of what I'd discovered pressing down on me like a physical burden. My sister wasn't just violent, she was a predator who systematically targeted vulnerable people and then relied on my family's resources to escape consequences. They'd enabled her to destroy lives while maintaining their respectable facade. But I also felt something else. Clarity. For the first time since Sandra had attacked me that morning, I knew exactly what I needed to do. I drove to the police station downtown and asked to speak with someone about reporting an assault. The officer who interviewed me was professional and thorough, taking detailed notes as I described not just my own attack, but everything I'd learned about Sandra's pattern of violence. You're alleging that your family has been systematically covering up multiple violent crimes over a period of several years? Officer Reynolds asked, her expression serious. I'm not alleging it, I said. I'm stating it as fact. I have the names and contact information of 3 previous victims, all of whom were paid to remain silent about their attacks. I also have medical records documenting our injuries. And you're willing to testify to all of this? Yes. And so are the other victims. They're tired of being silenced. Officer Reynolds made a few phone calls, and within an hour I was meeting with Detective Morgan from the department's Special Crimes Unit. He specialized in cases involving intimidation and witness tampering, and he listened to my story with the kind of focused attention that suggested he understood the implications. What you're describing is a criminal conspiracy, he said when I'd finished. Not just the original assaults, but the subsequent attempts to obstruct justice through bribery and intimidation. What happens now? Now we build a case. We'll need to interview all the victims, gather medical records, financial documents showing the payments made to keep people quiet. If what you're telling me is accurate, we're looking at multiple felony charges against your sister and potentially your parents as well. The thought of my parents facing criminal charges should have bothered me more than it did. But after seeing what they had allowed to happen to Judith, after learning about their systematic intimidation of victims, I felt nothing but a cold determination to see justice done. There's something else you should know, I said. My family is going to fight this. They have money, connections, influence in the community. They're not going to accept that their secret is finally coming out. Detective Morgan smiled grimly. We're used to dealing with people who think their wealth and status put them above the law. That's why cases like this are so important. I left the police station feeling simultaneously drained and energized. The 3 hours since I'd walked out of my parents' house had changed everything, just as I'd somehow known they would. I'd uncovered the truth about my family's conspiracy, connected with other victims, and set in motion the legal process that would finally hold Sandra accountable. But I knew the hardest part was still ahead of me. When I arrived back at my parents' house, I could see their cars in the driveway and knew they were waiting for me. The confrontation I was about to face would determine whether our family relationships could survive what I'd chosen to do. I walked through the front door to find all 3 of them sitting in the living room, their expressions ranging from worried to angry to desperate. They looked up as I entered, and I could see them taking in my bandaged head and the determined set of my shoulders. Thessaly, my father said carefully, we need to talk. Yes, I agreed, sitting down across from them. We do. We know you went to the hospital, my mother said. We called and confirmed that you'd been treated for your injury. We're relieved that you're all right. Are you? I asked, because your behavior this morning suggested otherwise. Sandra hadn't spoken yet, but I could see the fear in her eyes. She knew that once I'd left the house, I'd been beyond their control, free to learn things they'd hoped to keep hidden forever. We were trying to protect this family, my father said. Sometimes that requires making difficult decisions. Difficult for whom? I asked, because it wasn't difficult for Cordelia Thorne, or Marcus Whitfield, or Judith Calloway. It was devastating for them. The silence that followed my words was profound. I watched as my parents' faces went through a series of expressions. Shock that I knew those names, fear about what else I might have learned, and finally a kind of resignation that suggested they'd always known this moment would come. "You don't understand the full situation," my mother said weakly. "I understand enough," I replied. "I understand that Sandra has been violently attacking people for at least 6 years. I understand that you've been using money and intimidation to silence her victims. And I understand that you were willing to sacrifice my well-being this morning to protect your conspiracy." "It's not a conspiracy," my father protested. "We've been trying to help Sandra get the treatment she needs while preventing these incidents from destroying her future." "By destroying other people's futures instead," I said. "Do you have any idea what you did to Judith Calloway? She was a graduate student in psychology with her whole life ahead of her. Now she has permanent brain damage and lives in an assisted care facility." Sandra finally spoke, her voice small and broken. "I didn't mean for that to happen. I was having a bad day, and she challenged me in front of the whole group. I just reacted." "You just reacted," I repeated, "the same way you just reacted this morning when I suggested you might want a backup plan. The same way you just reacted when Marcus refused your advances. The same way you just reacted when Cordelia questioned your methods." "Those situations were different," she insisted, but there was no conviction in her voice. "No, they weren't. They were all situations where someone disagreed with you or challenged you, and you responded with violence. The only difference is that this time your victim isn't going to stay silent." The fear in their eyes was becoming more pronounced as they began to understand what I was telling them. "Thessaly," my mother said carefully, "I hope you haven't done something we'll all regret." "The only thing I regret is waiting so long to do it," I said. "I've spoken with the police. They're opening an investigation into Sandra's pattern of violence and your efforts to cover it up. They'll be contacting all of you soon." The room erupted in accusations and pleas and desperate attempts at negotiation. My father threatened to cut me off financially, though I'd been self-supporting for years. My mother appealed to my sense of family loyalty, as if loyalty meant enabling violence. Sandra alternated between claiming she was innocent and begging me to reconsider, but I was done listening to their manipulation. I stood up and walked toward the door, pausing only to deliver my final statement. "I spent 3 hours today learning about the real consequences of your choices," I said. "I met people whose lives were destroyed while you protected Sandra from accountability. I saw what happens when violence is met with silence instead of justice." "You're destroying this family," my father said, his voice heavy with accusation. "No," I replied. "I'm refusing to let this family destroy anyone else." As I walked out of that house for what I knew would be the last time, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. The absence of fear. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't worried about disappointing my parents or managing my sister's emotions or maintaining family harmony at the expense of truth. The legal proceedings that followed were exactly as difficult as I'd expected. My family hired expensive lawyers and attempted to discredit both me and the other victims. They portrayed Sandra as a troubled young woman who needed treatment rather than punishment, and they characterized the rest of us as vindictive people seeking money and attention. But the evidence was overwhelming. Medical records, financial documents showing the hush money payments, testimony from multiple victims describing identical patterns of behavior. Most damaging of all was Judith's testimony, delivered with the heartbreaking sincerity of someone whose cognitive impairment made deception impossible. Sandra was eventually convicted on multiple counts of assault and 1 count of aggravated battery for what she'd done to Judith. She received a prison sentence of 8 years with the possibility of parole after 5 if she successfully completed anger management and psychological treatment programs. My parents were convicted of obstruction of justice and witness intimidation. They received suspended sentences in exchange for paying restitution to all of Sandra's victims and agreeing to cooperate with any future investigations into similar cases. The trials made local news, and the family's reputation in the community was destroyed exactly as they'd feared. My father's business suffered, my mother resigned from her volunteer positions, and they eventually moved to another state to escape the attention and judgment. I never spoke to any of them again after that day in their living room. Some people told me I was heartless for destroying my own family, for choosing strangers over blood relatives, but I knew that what I'd chosen was justice over conspiracy, truth over comfortable lies, accountability over enablement. 3 years later, I received a letter from Sandra in prison. She'd completed 2 years of intensive therapy and wanted to apologize for what she'd done to me and to express her gratitude for forcing her to face consequences she'd been avoiding her entire adult life. "I hated you for a long time," she wrote, "but my therapist has helped me understand that what you did saved my life. I was becoming someone I didn't recognize, someone capable of hurting people in ways I never thought possible. Without intervention, I would have eventually killed someone." The letter also mentioned that she'd been participating in a victim impact program, writing letters of apology to everyone she'd hurt and contributing to a fund that provided additional support for Judith's care. I never responded to the letter, but I kept it, not as forgiveness, but as evidence that sometimes the most difficult choices lead to the most necessary outcomes. Today, I live in a different city, working for a nonprofit organization that provides support services to victims of family violence. It's meaningful work that grew directly out of my own experience, and it's shown me how many people struggle with the choice between family loyalty and personal safety. Judith Calloway still lives at Sunshine Manor, but she's made remarkable progress in her rehabilitation. She'll never fully recover from her brain injury, but she's learned to advocate for herself and has even begun volunteering with other traumatic brain injury survivors. Most importantly, she's free to tell her story without fear of legal retaliation. Marcus Whitfield rebuilt his yoga practice and now specializes in therapeutic yoga for trauma survivors. Cordelia Thorne went back to school for her master's in psychology and works with victims of domestic violence. We've all found ways to transform our experiences with violence into advocacy for others facing similar situations. In some ways, we've become the family that my biological family never was. People who protect each other, who believe each other's stories, who choose truth over comfort. That morning when Sandra hit me with the hairdryer seems like a lifetime ago now, but I still remember the moment when I realized that my family cared more about their reputation than my well-being, more about protecting their secret than preventing future violence. The decision I made 3 hours later changed everything, exactly as I'd somehow known it would. I chose to break the cycle of silence that had enabled my sister's violence for years. I chose to believe that accountability was more important than family harmony. I chose to put justice ahead of loyalty. It cost me my family, but it saved my soul. And sometimes that's a trade worth making.